Okay, let's dig into Carney's comparison of the Alberta referendum to Brexit. And our guest in studio has a really interesting perspective. Andrew Percy is a former Conservative member of the UK Parliament who voted in favour of Brexit and a former government minister of the United Kingdom. And so one of the things that happened, as I understand it for you, is that, as I say, you supported Brexit.
Yep.
But then your party was kind of divided after about whether to make a deal with the European Union. You wanted to. Some members didn't want to. What was it like managing that post-vote division within the party?
Well, I mean, the divisions actually go back to before the Brexit referendum. The reason we ended up with a referendum, and the Brexit analogy doesn't quite work in this context because, of course, we weren't voting to leave a country, we were voting to leave a trading bloc. But the big divisions in the Conservative Party, really ever since we joined the European Union, and that's what actually, those divisions just became stronger and stronger. That's what led to us having the referendum in the first place. Those divisions didn't go away with the referendum, of course. They continued afterwards, and it became very difficult for, the number of prime ministers we had afterwards, I think, tells a story on just how hard it became to manage all of these competing different agendas. You had people who were very in favour of leaving, people who were very in favour of remain, and as I say, those divisions didn't go away, and it ultimately ended up with the Conservative Party being booted out of office, of course, because we were seen as not able to get our own act together following all of those divisions.
And you leaving politics over all of this, I guess,
yeah,
right?
in part. I mean, I think there's a lot more to it because, of course, we've seen a whole rise of populism across the West. That's something which, you could argue these referenda are a symptom of, maybe they're a cause of. But I think these populist sentiments you're finding across Europe and the US, Canada isn't immune to that. You're seeing that here in BC over a number of issues. You're seeing it in Alberta on the separation issue. And of course, even in Quebec, you could argue. But it becomes almost impossible for, moderate mainstream political leaders to ignore those. And I suspect that's why the Premier in Alberta has found herself in the position where she has to call this referendum.
Yeah, I host a national call-in show on CBC on Sundays called Cross Country Checkup. And yesterday we talked about Alberta separatism and a point that some Albertans made, and in fact some Albertans kind of illustrated by their calls, is that there are the economic issues that some separatists are, kind of advocating. But then there's some deeper issues, right? And some of them, are maybe a little bit unsettling about wanting to have a certain kind of Alberta or a certain kind of Albertan celebrated. And so I assume in terms of support for Brexit, there was a little bit of that too, right?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent. And the same in the Scottish independence referendum, which is perhaps actually a better analogy in the Alberta context. But, I think what fundamentally is underneath a lot of it is you have a lot of people now who don't feel they're getting much out of the system. And that's what really Brexit was. Of course, there were people who had some unpleasant views who may have voted for Brexit, just as there may be in Alberta. But it would be wrong to characterise people who wanted to leave the European Union, just as it would be wrong to characterise Alberta separatists as, kind of bigots or racists. I think a lot of people just don't feel the system's working for them. They don't feel they have an investment in the system and that they're not getting a fair deal. And that was what was behind a lot of the Brexit referendum sentiment. I think the mistake political leaders make potentially, and I think the Prime Minister could come close to this by talking about a bluff, is insulting voters or telling them that what they want to vote for is stupid or silly or ill-educated. And that's what, in both the Scottish independence referendum and the Brexit referendum, the Remain side, both of them made the mistake of doing. And the consequence of that seemed to be to push more people towards those two leave options.
Yeah, that's really good insight. And we have some examples of that in Canada over the years as well. So let's pick up on that. We have a little less than a minute left. If the Prime Minister were to call you and say, how should I conduct myself here in trying to oppose separatism in Alberta, what would you say to him?
I would say look at the lessons from the Scottish referendum and the Brexit referendum. Look, I was on the Remain side of one of those and the Leave side of the other. As I say, the mistake the two Remain camps both made, and they did pivot just in time in the Scottish independence referendum, was to tell people that this was clearly a silly thing to do, that this was stupid, it was unworkable, and that people voting for it were not smart. We had every business leader, including Mark Carney as Governor of the Bank of England, kind of come out on the side of Remain. And that just pushed more people because it looked like the system that you don't feel you're invested in, the establishment is trying to tell you that you're too stupid to know what's good for you. So I think there are important lessons to be learned, like show respect to the separatist sentiment. And I think that's probably the most sensible lessons that can be taken from those two referenda in the UK.
Yeah, there's some real wisdom in there. Andrew Percy, a former Conservative member of the UK Parliament, now living in Vancouver. I hope we get a chance to speak to you again. Thank you very much.
Anytime.